The gate screamed. Among 23 orange uniforms, he sat smaller, silent third row, hands folded. In the cafeteria, he chose the wrong table. Silence spread, boots thudded, 5 steps, a heavy hand on his shoulder, knees bending, eyes down, until a wrist snapped sideways unseen. The king blinked. The room exhaled. Some mistakes cost more than you can imagine. The steel gates of Riverside Correctional screamed against their hinges as the transport bus lurched through the entrance. Inside, 23 men sat shackled, their orange uniforms a uniform declaration of defeat. But among them, one figure seemed smaller somehow, quieter. Vincent Romano sat in the third row, his hands folded, his gaze fixed on nothing. The other inmates had already sized him up during the 2-hour ride. Soft hands, no visible scars. The kind of man who probably cried during intake. The bus shuddered to a stop. Guards barked orders, chains rattled, and bodies shuffled toward the exit. Vincent moved with the flow, never looking up, never making contact. In the processing line, he answered questions in single words. Yes, sir. No, sir. Understood, sir. The intake officer barely glanced at him while stamping forms. Another white-collar criminal. Probably embezzlement. They always looked the same. Cell Block C was a concrete cathedral of violence. 3 tiers of cells stretched upward like a metal honeycomb, each one a small hell containing its own demons. The sound echoed differently here. Every footstep, every whisper, every threat bounced off the walls and multiplied. Vincent was assigned to cell 247, upper tier. As he climbed the metal stairs carrying his thin mattress and standard-issue toiletries, conversations stopped. Eyes followed. Predators evaluating prey. Tommy, the tank. Kozlov watched from his position near the common area television. 6 feet 4 inches of scarred muscle, with knuckles that had broken more faces than he could count. He'd been king of this block for 7 years, ever since he'd beaten the previous king into a coma with a sock full of batteries. The tank ruled through simple mathematics. Pain plus fear equals respect. And Vincent Romano looked like he'd never solved that equation in his life. Fresh meat, whispered Carlos, one of Tank's lieutenants. A thin man with teardrop tattoos and yellowed teeth. Looks like he'd cry if you looked at him wrong. Tank didn't respond immediately. He studied Vincent's walk, the way he held his shoulders, the careful manner in which he arranged his few possessions in the cell. Everything about the man screamed weakness. But Tank had learned something during his decades inside. The first impression was often a lie. Still, Vincent seemed genuine in his fragility. The way he flinched when another inmate slammed a cell door. The manner in which he kept his eyes down during count. This wasn't an act. The first test came during dinner. The cafeteria was a minefield of unspoken rules and invisible territories. Vincent took his tray. Mystery meat, instant potatoes, and something that might have been vegetables, and looked for an empty table. That's when he made his first mistake. He sat at a table that had been claimed by the Aryan Brotherhood 3 years ago. The silence spread outward like a drop of poison in still water. You lost, old man? The voice belonged to Derek Haynes, a skinny white supremacist with a spider web tattooed on his elbow. Derek wasn't particularly dangerous on his own, but he had backup. More importantly, he had Tank's permission to enforce certain rules. Vincent looked up slowly, his fork halfway to his mouth. I'm sorry. This table. You don't belong here. The entire cafeteria was watching now. Guards pretended not to notice. They had their own rules about intervention. Vincent set down his fork carefully, his movements deliberate and calm. I didn't see anyone sitting here. Derek's face flushed red. In prison, respect was currency, and Vincent had just declared Derek's money worthless. You calling me a liar? I'm saying I made a mistake. Vincent stood slowly, picking up his tray. I'll find somewhere else. That should have been the end of it. A simple misunderstanding resolved without violence. But Tank was watching, and Tank had different plans. He rose from his table across the room, his massive frame casting a shadow that seemed to darken half the cafeteria. When Tank moved, everyone noticed. Hold on there, new fish. Tank's voice carried easily across the noise. Derek asked you a question. Vincent turned, still holding his tray. For the first time since arriving, he made direct eye contact with someone. Tank felt a strange sensation, like looking into deep water at night. There was something there far below the surface, but he couldn't quite see what it was. I answered him. Vincent said quietly, I made a mistake. I'm moving. See? That's where you're wrong. Tank began walking toward him, his boots echoing on the concrete floor. You didn't make a mistake. You disrespected my boy Derek. And when you disrespect one of mine, you disrespect me. The mathematics of prison politics were simple. Tank couldn't let this slide. If he showed weakness with the new fish, others would test him. His authority depended on consistent brutality. Vincent seemed to understand this, nodding slowly as Tank approached. I don't want any trouble, Vincent said. Too late for that old-timer. Tank was close enough now to smell Vincent's soap, the cheap stuff they gave you during intake. See? Trouble's already here. Question is how much pain you want with it. Vincent set his tray down on the nearest table. The cafeteria had gone completely silent. Even the guards had stopped pretending not to watch. This was theater, and everyone knew their roles. Tank would demonstrate his power, Vincent would be humiliated, and the natural order would be maintained. Please, Vincent said, his voice barely above a whisper. I just want to do my time. Tank smiled. This was easier than he'd expected. Then you should have thought about that before you sat in the wrong place. He placed a massive hand on Vincent's shoulder, fingers digging into the fabric of his uniform. Now you're going to apologize to Derek. On your knees. The hand on his shoulder was meant to be intimidating, but Vincent felt something else entirely. Tank's grip was strong but sloppy. His stance was wide but unbalanced. His confidence was genuine but untested against someone who knew how to fight. For the first time since arriving at Riverside, Vincent smiled. It was a small smile, barely visible, but Tank saw it. Something funny, old man? Vincent looked up at him, and Tank felt that strange sensation again, like looking into an abyss that was looking back. No, Vincent said softly. Nothing funny at all. But Tank had already committed. In front of 200 inmates, he'd started something that had to be finished. Prison politics demanded completion. He increased the pressure on Vincent's shoulder, forcing him down. On your knees, fish. Vincent's legs began to bend. The crowd watched, some disappointed by the anticlimactic resolution, others satisfied by the predictable outcome. Tank felt the familiar rush of dominance, the chemical high of imposing his will on another human being. This was why he was king. That's when Vincent moved. The movement was so subtle that most of the cafeteria missed it. One moment Vincent was sinking toward his knees. The next, Tank's wrist was bent at an impossible angle, and the giant was stumbling backward, his face twisted in confusion and pain. It happened in the space between heartbeats, faster than thought, smoother than silk. Tank stared at his hand, flexing his fingers experimentally. The pain was sharp, but not unbearable. What disturbed him more was the fact that he couldn't understand how it had happened. Vincent was standing exactly where he'd been before, hands at his sides, expression unchanged. The only difference was that Tank was no longer touching him. You okay, Tank? Carlos had moved closer, his hand instinctively reaching toward the shank hidden in his waistband. The other inmates were murmuring now, sensing that something unexpected had occurred. Tank rubbed his wrist, his eyes never leaving Vincent's face. Yeah, I'm fine. But he wasn't fine. In 23 years of violence, no one had ever moved his hand without him seeing it happen. No one had ever made him feel clumsy. Lucky move, old man. Vincent said nothing. He simply stood there waiting. The silence stretched uncomfortably. Tank was supposed to retaliate, supposed to escalate. That was the script. But something held him back. A primitive instinct that whispered warnings in a language older than words. Instead, he pointed at Vincent with the hand that didn't hurt. We'll finish this later, Tank announced to the cafeteria. When there's more privacy. It was a face-saving retreat, but a retreat nonetheless. The crowd began to disperse, disappointed by the anticlimactic ending. Derek looked confused. He'd been expecting Vincent to grovel, not for Tank to walk away. But Tank was already moving toward the exit, his lieutenants falling in behind him like confused ducklings. Vincent picked up his tray and found an empty table in the corner. He ate slowly, mechanically, never looking around, but he could feel the eyes on him. The mathematics of prison had shifted slightly, and everyone was trying to calculate the new equation. In his cell that night, Tank lay on his narrow bunk and stared at the ceiling. His wrist still ached, not from injury but from the memory of helplessness. He'd been in hundreds of fights, won most of them, lost a few, but he'd never been handled like that, like he was a child trying to wrestle with his father. Boss? Carlos's voice drifted from the cell next door. You thinking about the new guy? I'm thinking about sleep, Tank lied. Want me to handle him? Make it look like an accident? Tank considered this. It would be simple enough. Carlos had killed before, quietly and efficiently. An overdose of stolen insulin, a slip in the shower. Vincent would disappear and Tank's reputation would remain intact. But that felt like admitting defeat. No, Tank said finally. I handle my own problems. 3 cells down, Vincent Romano sat cross-legged on his bunk, eyes closed, breathing deeply. To anyone watching, he appeared to be meditating. In reality, he was remembering. The weight of Tank's hand, the angle of his wrist, the distribution of his balance. Tank was strong and experienced, but he fought like a brawler. All muscle, no technique. Vincent had been dealing with men like Tank since he was 16 years old. The next morning brought routine. Breakfast, work detail, lunch, yard time. Vincent moved through it all like a ghost, performing his assigned tasks without complaint or comment. He'd been assigned to the laundry, folding endless loads of orange uniforms and gray sheets. The work was mindless, which suited him perfectly. It gave him time to observe. The prison had its own ecosystem, its own food chain. Tank sat at the top, but beneath him were layers of predators and prey. The gang members who controlled the drug trade, the lifers who commanded respect through sheer endurance, the trustees who wielded power through access and information, and at the bottom, the fish, new inmates who hadn't yet found their place in the hierarchy. Vincent understood hierarchies. He'd spent 30 years building one of the most sophisticated criminal organizations on the East Coast. The Romano family wasn't the largest or the loudest, but it was the most disciplined. Vincent had learned from his father that power wasn't about intimidation. It was about information, patience, and the precise application of violence when necessary. During yard time, he walked the perimeter alone. The yard was divided into invisible territories. The weight pit belonged to the Aryans, the basketball court to the blacks, the picnic tables to the Latinos. Vincent stayed in neutral ground, moving slowly along the fence line, hands clasped behind his back. He looked like an old man taking a leisurely stroll. You're the one who grabbed Tank's hand. The voice belonged to Marcus Webb, a 40-something black man with intelligent eyes and graying temples. Marcus was serving life for armed robbery, but he'd earned respect as a mediator and counselor. Word is you made him look foolish. Vincent paused in his walk. I didn't make him do anything. He made his own choices. Smooth talker. Marcus fell into step beside him. You got training? Military? Martial arts? I learned to defend myself. That's all? Vincent stopped walking and looked directly at Marcus. That's all anyone needs to know. Marcus nodded slowly. He'd seen enough violence to recognize the difference between posturing and genuine capability. Vincent carried himself like someone who'd been tested and had passed those tests. Tank won't let it go, you know. His reputation is everything to him. I understand. Do you? Because this isn't the outside world. In here, reputation is survival. Tank has to come at you again, and next time he won't make it public. He'll bring friends. Vincent resumed walking. Thank you for the warning. You don't seem worried. Worry changes nothing. That evening, Tank made his move. Vincent was returning from the shower, a thin towel wrapped around his waist, when he found his cell occupied. Tank sat on the narrow bunk, flanked by Carlos and 2 other men Vincent didn't recognize. The message was clear. You can't hide. Evening, fish. Tank's voice was conversational, almost friendly. Thought we might have that private conversation. Vincent entered the cell calmly, hanging his towel on the hook by the door. He pulled on his uniform slowly, without haste or apparent concern. What would you like to discuss? Respect. Tank stood, his massive frame filling most of the small space. See, yesterday you made me look bad. In front of my people, that can't stand. I was defending myself. You were showing off. Carlos stepped forward, a homemade knife visible in his hand, making Tank look weak. Vincent finished buttoning his shirt. I have no interest in making anyone look anything. I just want to serve my time. Too late for that. Tank cracked his knuckles, the sound echoing off the concrete walls. Now we gotta settle this properly. The cell door slammed shut. Vincent heard the distinctive click of the lock. One of the guards was obviously on Tank's payroll. He was trapped in a 6x8 space with 4 men who intended to hurt him badly. The smart move would be to submit, take the beating, hope they didn't kill him. That's what the old Vincent would have done. The Vincent who'd spent 47 years avoiding direct confrontation whenever possible. But prison had a way of stripping away pretense. In here, you were reduced to your essential self. And Vincent's essential self was something far more dangerous than anyone suspected. Before we begin, Vincent said quietly, I should mention something. Tank paused, his fist already drawn back. What? Vincent looked at each man in turn, memorizing their faces. My name isn't Vincent Romano. The confusion was visible on their faces. Carlos glanced at Tank, who shrugged. So what is it? Vincent smiled, and for the first time since arriving at Riverside, it reached his eyes. Vincent Torino. And you just locked yourselves in here with me. The name hit Tank like a physical blow. Every criminal on the East Coast knew that name. Vincent the Ghost Torino, head of the most feared crime family in 3 states. The man who'd never been photographed, never been recorded, never left witnesses. The phantom who controlled hundreds of millions in illegal revenue while remaining completely invisible to law enforcement. You're lying, Carlos whispered, but his hand was shaking. Vincent rolled his shoulders, loosening muscles that hadn't been properly tested in years. Romano was my mother's maiden name. I've been using it for the past 18 months, since the indictments came down. But names are just costumes, aren't they? Underneath, we are who we've always been. Tank's mouth had gone dry. You're in here for tax evasion. I'm in here because someone in my organization got careless with paperwork. But tax evasion was the only thing they could prove. Vincent's voice remained conversational, almost gentle. Everything else, the murders, the extortion, the human trafficking, those charges disappeared when witnesses started having accidents. The cell felt smaller suddenly, the air thicker. Carlos still held his knife, but it seemed inadequate now, like bringing a fly swatter to hunt a tiger. Now then, Vincent continued, we seem to have a problem. You gentlemen broke into my home to threaten me. In my world, that's traditionally a capital offense. The silence in the cell stretched like a wire under tension, ready to snap. Tank's breathing had become audible, shallow rasps that seemed unnaturally loud in the confined space. Carlos still gripped his shank, but his knuckles had gone white with the effort. The 2 other men, Rico and Deke, pressed themselves against the cell wall as if they could somehow disappear into the concrete. Vincent sat down on his bunk with the casual air of a man settling into his favorite armchair. The thing about reputation, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, is that it's built on stories. And stories, gentlemen, have a way of spreading. Tank found his voice, though it came out rougher than intended. You're talking shit, old man. Vincent Torino is a myth. A boogeyman story that cops tell to scare each other. Is he? Vincent's smile widened slightly. Tell me, Mr. Kozlov. Yes, I know your real name. What happened to Jimmy the Fish Marconi in 2019? Tank's face went pale. Jimmy Marconi had been a mid-level enforcer for the Torino family who'd decided to start his own operation. He'd been found 3 weeks later in the trunk of his car, positioned in such a way that it looked like he was sleeping. No wounds, no signs of violence. The coroner ruled it death by natural causes, but everyone on the street knew better. Lucky guess, Tank muttered, but his conviction was cracking. Vincent reached slowly into his pocket and withdrew something small. A coin, silver and worn smooth. He began rolling it across his knuckles with practiced ease, the metal catching the dim light from the overhead bulb. Jimmy thought he was untouchable too. Had 30 men backing him, controlled 6 blocks in South Philly. But he made one crucial mistake. The coin danced between Vincent's fingers, appearing and disappearing like a magic trick. Tank couldn't look away from it. He forgot that respect isn't taken. It's earned, and it's maintained through very careful choices. Vincent caught the coin and held it up so the light reflected off its surface. Jimmy chose poorly. Carlos's hand was trembling now. Boss, maybe we should... Shut up, Tank snapped, but his voice lacked its usual authority. He was doing mental calculations, trying to determine if Vincent was bluffing. The details about Jimmy Marconi were accurate, but they could have been learned from any number of sources. Prison was full of stories, and stories grew in the telling. Vincent seemed to read his thoughts. You're wondering if I'm telling the truth. That's reasonable. After all, what would Vincent Torino be doing in a place like this, wearing prison orange, folding laundry? He pocketed the coin with a fluid motion. The answer is simple. I'm hiding. From who? Rico spoke for the first time, his voice cracking slightly. From people who want me dead. Federal agents who want me in a supermax. Rival families who want my territory. Sometimes the safest place for a wolf is among the sheep. Vincent's eyes moved to each man in turn. The question is, what kind of animals are you? Tank was beginning to sweat despite the cell's chill. If Vincent was telling the truth and the details he knew suggested he might be, then this was no longer a simple prison confrontation. This was something far more dangerous. But backing down now would destroy Tank's credibility forever. Even if you are who you say, Tank said slowly, you're still locked in here with us. 4 against 1. Your reputation don't mean shit if you're dead. Vincent nodded approvingly. Exactly right. Which brings us to the interesting part of our conversation. He stood up, moving with the fluid grace that Tank had noticed in the cafeteria. You see, I have a choice to make. I can kill all 4 of you right now. And yes, Mr. Kozlov, I absolutely can. Or I can make you an offer. What kind of offer? Deke asked nervously. The kind that keeps you breathing. Vincent moved to the center of the cell, forcing the 4 men to arrange themselves around him like points on a compass. I need allies in here. Protection while I serve my time. In exchange, I can offer you something more valuable than fear. What? Tank demanded. Information, connections, the kind of opportunities that turn a prison gang into a real organization. Vincent's voice dropped even lower, forcing them to lean in to hear him. I know which guards can be bought, which inmates are federal informants, which shipments are coming through the loading dock next month. I know things that could make you very rich men. Carlos lowered his knife slightly. What shipments? Vincent smiled. Mr. Medina shows interest. The kind of shipments that are supposed to go to evidence lockup, but somehow end up in the wrong hands. Cocaine, heroin, untraceable weapons. The kind of merchandise that sells for premium prices inside these walls. Tank felt the ground shifting beneath him. This wasn't how these conversations were supposed to go. He was supposed to intimidate, Vincent was supposed to submit, and natural order was supposed to be restored. Instead, he found himself listening to what sounded suspiciously like a business proposition. Why should we trust you? Tank asked. Because trust is a luxury neither of us can afford. Vincent's tone became almost businesslike. This is about mutual benefit. You provide muscle and local knowledge. I provide strategy and outside connections. Together, we could control more than just this cell block. Rico stepped forward slightly. And if we say no? Vincent's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. Something cold and final. Then you leave this cell, and tomorrow, you wake up dead. The threat was delivered so calmly, so matter-of-factly, that it took a moment to register. Tank had heard thousands of threats during his time inside. Most were bluster, empty posturing designed to mask fear. This was different. This carried the weight of absolute certainty. You're outnumbered, Carlos pointed out, though his voice lacked conviction. Am I? Vincent glanced at his watch. A cheap plastic thing that came from the commissary. It's been 7 minutes since you locked that door. Guard rotation happens every 15 minutes in this block. That gives us 8 minutes to reach an understanding. Tank's mind was racing. If Vincent really was Vincent Torino, then killing him would bring down a war that Tank couldn't win. But if he was lying, then backing down would make Tank look weak in front of his own crew. Either way, Tank's position was compromised. What exactly are you proposing? Tank asked carefully. Partnership. You continue to run day-to-day operations in this block. I provide strategic guidance and outside support. We split profits 60-40. 60-40 in whose favor? Vincent's smile returned. Mine, naturally. I'm bringing more value to the table. It was an insult disguised as a business offer. Tank should have been furious. Instead, he found himself considering it. Vincent spoke with the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed, the casual authority that came from years of commanding genuinely dangerous men. Tank had seen enough real power to recognize it when it was standing 3 feet away from him. How do we know you're not setting us up? Deke asked. Could be you're working with the feds. Vincent laughed, a genuine sound of amusement. Mr. Williams, if I were working with federal agents, do you really think I'd be having this conversation? I'd simply wait for you to incriminate yourselves and then testify at your trials. The fact that Vincent knew Deke's real name, something the man had never shared with anyone in prison, settled the matter. This was either Vincent Torino or someone with access to the same information networks. Either way, he was dangerous. Tank made his decision. 40-60, he countered. And we want proof. Something that shows you can deliver. Reasonable. Vincent checked his watch again. Guard change in 3 minutes. But I can give you something right now. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to barely audible. Cell 247 in D block contains 2 kilos of uncut heroin. It's hidden inside the mattress of an inmate named Peterson, James Peterson, serving time for armed robbery. Peterson doesn't know it's there. It was planted by a guard named Williams who's been skimming from evidence lockup. Carlos's eyes widened. How could you possibly know that? Because guard Williams works for me. Has for the past 6 months. And Peterson is scheduled to be transferred to solitary tomorrow morning for a fight he hasn't had yet. Vincent straightened up. You have 12 hours to retrieve that merchandise before it disappears forever. The implications hit Tank like a physical blow. If Vincent was telling the truth, then he had already penetrated the prison's security network. If he was lying, they'd know soon enough. Either way, Tank had to make a choice. And if we find this heroin, then we discuss terms for a more permanent arrangement. Vincent moved toward the cell door, his back to the 4 armed men as if they posed no threat whatsoever. But first you need to unlock this door and let me return to my evening routine. I have meditation to complete. Tank stared at him for a long moment, then nodded to Carlos. Open it. Hey, you know what? This story is getting under our skin in the best possible way. If you're feeling that same tension, that need to know what happens when power meets power in the most dangerous game of all, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what comes next. Because Vincent Torino's first night in prison is just the beginning. What choice would you make if you discovered your cellmate was one of the most dangerous men alive? Drop your thoughts below. We want to know if you'd take the deal or take your chances. The cell door clicked open with mechanical precision. Tank stepped aside, his massive frame creating just enough space for Vincent to pass. For a moment the 2 men stood close enough to feel each other's breath. Tank's hands were clenched into fists, every muscle in his body coiled for violence. Vincent appeared completely relaxed, as if he were stepping out of an elevator rather than a potential death trap. 12 hours, Vincent said quietly, his eyes meeting Tank's. Cell 247, D block, inside the mattress. Then he was gone, walking down the corridor with the unhurried pace of a man taking an evening stroll. Tank watched until Vincent disappeared around the corner, then closed the cell door with deliberate care. The 4 men stood in silence for several seconds, each processing what had just occurred. Boss? Carlos finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. What the fuck just happened? Tank rubbed his face with both hands, feeling suddenly exhausted. I think we just met the devil. You believe him? Rico asked. About who he is? The name recognition was real, Deke said thoughtfully. And he knew things. Personal things. Tank nodded slowly. Question is, what do we do about it? The answer came 3 hours later during evening count. Tank positioned himself near the corridor junction where he could observe D block without appearing to show interest. At exactly 9:47 p.m., Guard Williams made his rounds. Nothing unusual about that. Williams always checked D block at 9:47. What was unusual was the way he paused at cell 247, glanced around nervously, then continued his patrol at double pace. Tank had been watching Williams for months without really seeing him. Middle-aged, slightly overweight, the kind of corrections officer who did his job competently, but without distinction. Now Tank noticed other details. The expensive watch, the new shoes, the way Williams avoided eye contact with certain inmates, the signs of a man living beyond his means. At 11:15 p.m., Tank made his move. The prison settled into its nighttime rhythm. Reduced lighting, skeleton guard crew, inmates locked in their cells. But Tank had cultivated relationships that provided certain privileges. A word to the right trustee, a favor called in from a sympathetic guard, and suddenly Tank found himself with access to areas that were supposed to be off limits. D block was eerily quiet. Tank moved through the corridors like a ghost, decades of prison experience teaching him how to avoid detection. Cell 247 was on the second tier, home to James Peterson, a small-time criminal serving 8 years for robbing convenience stores. Peterson was snoring loudly, completely unaware that his cell had become the center of a very dangerous game. Tank picked the lock with tools acquired through years of careful trading. The mechanism was old and yielded easily to experienced fingers. Peterson didn't stir as Tank slipped inside and began examining the mattress. The hiding spot was sophisticated, a careful incision along the seam, virtually invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. His fingers found the packages immediately. 2 bags, each roughly the size of a paperback book, wrapped in plastic and duct tape. Tank's heart hammered as he extracted them, knowing that discovery would mean years in solitary confinement. But the weight and texture were unmistakable. This was pure heroin, worth more than most inmates earned in a year of legitimate work. Tank was back in his own cell by midnight, the drugs hidden in a location known only to him. He lay on his bunk staring at the ceiling, trying to process the implications. Vincent had delivered exactly what he'd promised, which meant everything else was probably true as well. Vincent Torino, the Vincent Torino, was sleeping 3 cells away, serving time for tax evasion while planning something far more complex than simple survival. The next morning brought chaos to D Block. Peterson was discovered beaten unconscious in his cell, apparently the victim of an inmate assault that had somehow occurred despite the locked doors and regular guard patrols. He was transferred to the prison hospital, then to solitary confinement pending investigation. His cell was searched thoroughly, but nothing suspicious was found. Tank watched the drama unfold from the common area, drinking watery coffee and reading a 3-year-old newspaper. Vincent sat at a nearby table, methodically eating breakfast and showing no interest in the commotion. When their eyes met briefly, Vincent offered the slightest of nods, acknowledgement that the first phase of their arrangement had been completed successfully. Peterson got worked over pretty good, Carlos observed, sliding into the seat across from Tank. Word is he don't remember nothing about what happened. Convenient, Tank replied. You think Torino arranged it? Tank folded his newspaper carefully. I think Vincent Torino is a man who plans ahead. That afternoon, Tank requested a meeting. They gathered in the chapel during a time slot when the building was officially closed for maintenance. Tank, Carlos, Rico, and Deke sat in the front pew while Vincent stood at the altar, hands clasped behind his back like a priest preparing to deliver a sermon. Gentlemen, Vincent began, his voice carrying easily in the empty space. I trust last night's demonstration was convincing. Tank reached into his jacket and withdrew one of the packages, placing it on the wooden pew between them. 2 kilos, exactly like you said, pure as advertised. And Peterson? Won't be talking to anyone for a long time, Carlos reported. Convenient accident during transport. Vincent nodded approvingly. Excellent. Now we can discuss the future. For the next hour, Vincent laid out a plan that was breathtaking in its scope and audacity. The prison wasn't just a place to serve time. It was a business opportunity waiting to be exploited. Guards could be corrupted through a combination of bribery and blackmail. Inmates could be organized into efficient distribution networks. The flow of contraband could be systematized and scaled up dramatically. The beauty of operating inside a correctional facility, Vincent explained, is that your customer base is captive, literally. Demand is constant, competition is limited, and law enforcement has reduced presence because they assume the walls keep the criminals contained. Rico raised his hand tentatively. What about the warden? Administration? Warden Morrison has been skimming from the rehabilitation budget for 3 years, Vincent replied without hesitation. He's vulnerable to pressure. As for the rest of administration, they're primarily concerned with avoiding scandals that might affect their careers. Give them plausible deniability, and they'll look the other way. Tank leaned forward. You've been planning this since before you got here. I've been planning this since the day I was indicted, Vincent corrected. Prison was always a possibility. I don't enter any situation without multiple contingency plans. Deke shifted nervously. What happens when your sentence is up? Do we just go back to the way things were? Vincent's smile was enigmatic. Mr. Williams, I'm serving 18 months for tax evasion, but the appeal process is lengthy, and there are other charges pending in other jurisdictions. I could be here for 5 years, maybe longer. The implications were clear. Vincent wasn't planning a temporary operation. He was building an empire that could last for years. Tank found himself simultaneously impressed and terrified by the scope of Vincent's ambitions. What do you need from us? Tank asked finally. Loyalty, discipline, and the understanding that this organization operates by different rules than what you're accustomed to. Vincent's tone became harder, more authoritative. No more random violence, no more chaos. Every action must serve a purpose, every decision must be calculated. Carlos looked skeptical. This ain't the streets, boss. Prison got its own rules. And those rules are about to change. Vincent stepped down from the altar, moving closer to the 4 men. The old way, ruling through fear and intimidation, is inefficient. It creates enemies and attracts attention. We're going to rule through indispensability. Meaning? Meaning we become essential to the smooth operation of this facility. Guards will need us to maintain order. Inmates will need us to access forbidden goods and services. Administration will need us to prevent the kind of incidents that generate media attention. Vincent's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. We don't break the system, we become the system. Tank realized he was witnessing something unprecedented. Not just another prison gang looking to control territory, but the transformation of a correctional facility into a sophisticated criminal enterprise. Vincent wasn't adapting to prison. He was reshaping it to suit his needs. There's one more thing, Vincent continued. A demonstration of good faith. Tomorrow night there's going to be an incident in the East Wing. A fight between rival gangs that gets out of hand. 3 men will be hospitalized. The guards will be overwhelmed and will request assistance from inmates they trust. How do you know all this? Rico asked. Vincent checked his cheap watch. Because I've arranged it, and tomorrow night you gentlemen are going to prove that you can follow orders without asking questions. The East Wing erupted in violence at exactly 8:23 p.m. Tank heard the alarms from 3 corridors away. A piercing wail that cut through the evening quiet like a blade. Emergency lights flashed red patterns across the concrete walls, while boots thundered down hallways as guards rushed toward the disturbance. From his cell, Tank could hear the unmistakable sounds of chaos. Shouting voices, metal against metal, the wet impact of fists against flesh. Jesus, Carlos whispered from the next cell. Sounds like a war zone. Tank pressed himself against the bars, trying to see down the corridor. The timing was perfect, exactly as Vincent had predicted. 3 guards ran past, fumbling with their radios and looking genuinely panicked. Whatever was happening in the East Wing, it was beyond their experience or training. 20 minutes later, Guard Williams appeared at Tank's cell, his face flushed and his uniform disheveled. Kozlov, he panted. We need your help. Tank feigned surprise. My help? There's a situation. Gang fight got out of hand. We've got multiple injuries and the whole wing is going crazy. Williams glanced nervously down the corridor. Warden says to use any resources necessary to restore order. What kind of resources? Inmates who can influence the others. Keep them calm until we get reinforcements. Williams produced a set of keys with shaking hands. You and your crew. Temporary trustee status. Tank allowed himself to look hesitant. That's a big responsibility, Officer Williams. There's overtime pay in it. Extra commissary privileges. Williams was sweating now, desperation making him careless. Come on, Kozlov, help us out here. Tank exchanged glances with Carlos, then nodded slowly. All right, but we do this my way. The East Wing was a masterpiece of controlled chaos. Vincent had orchestrated it perfectly. A genuine fight between rival factions, but one that escalated in precisely calculated stages. By the time Tank and his crew arrived, the immediate violence had ended, but the aftermath was spectacular. Overturned tables, broken windows, blood on the walls. 3 inmates were being loaded onto stretchers while others sat in restraints, shouting accusations and threats. Thank God, Lieutenant Morrison breathed when he saw Tank approaching. Morrison was the warden's nephew, a man who'd gotten his position through family connections rather than competence. Can you help us get these animals under control? Tank surveyed the scene with professional detachment. What started it? Something about territory, drug dealing rights in the South Yard. Morrison wiped his forehead with a handkerchief. These idiots don't understand that violence like this brings heat from the State Commission. I can talk to them, Tank offered. Get them to see reason. For the next 2 hours, Tank and his crew worked to restore order. But they weren't just calming the situation, they were gathering intelligence. Names of the injured inmates. Details about the contraband that had allegedly started the fight. Information about which guards had responded slowly, and which had shown genuine competence under pressure. Vincent appeared near the end of the incident, assigned to a cleanup crew that arrived to deal with the physical damage. He worked quietly, mopping blood from the floor and collecting debris. But Tank noticed how he positioned himself to overhear conversations between administrators. When their eyes met briefly, Vincent offered the slightest smile of satisfaction. The next morning brought unexpected rewards. Tank found himself summoned to the warden's office, a rare honor that typically preceded either punishment or opportunity. Warden Harrison Morrison was a political appointee, a man in his early 50s who treated the prison as a stepping stone to higher office. His office was decorated with photographs of himself shaking hands with various politicians and law enforcement officials. "Sit down, Kozlov," the warden said, gesturing to a chair across from his imposing desk. "I want to thank you for last night." Tank adopted his most respectful tone. "Just doing what needed to be done, sir. Lieutenant Morrison tells me you and your associates were instrumental in restoring order. That kind of initiative doesn't go unnoticed." The warden opened a file folder and made several notations. "I'm recommending you for trustee status. Permanent this time." "Thank you, sir. There's more." The warden leaned back in his chair, studying Tank with calculating eyes. "I'm looking for inmates who can help prevent future incidents. Men with influence who understand that cooperation benefits everyone." Tank nodded thoughtfully. "I'd be honored to assist in any way possible." "Good. You'll report directly to Lieutenant Morrison. Your job is to keep the peace. Identify potential problems before they escalate. In exchange, you'll have certain privileges: extended yard time, better work assignments, access to areas normally restricted to trustees." It was exactly what Vincent had predicted. The administration was creating a structure that would give Tank's crew legitimate authority within the prison hierarchy. They would be enforcers disguised as peacekeepers, with official sanction for their activities. That afternoon, Tank met with Vincent in the library, a vast room filled with outdated books and broken computers. They sat at adjacent tables, ostensibly reading, but actually conducting business in whispered conversations. "Phase 2 complete," Vincent murmured, his eyes focused on a book about American history. "You now have official access to restricted areas. Morrison wants us to prevent future incidents," Tank replied, turning a page in his own book. "Keep the peace. And you will. Selectively." Vincent's smile was barely visible. "Some incidents serve our purposes. Others threaten our operations. Your job is to know the difference." Over the following weeks, Tank began to understand the true scope of Vincent's vision. The prison was being transformed into something unprecedented, a criminal organization that operated with official blessing. Guards who had once been obstacles became partners. Inmates who had once been rivals became employees. The chaos that typically characterized prison life was replaced by efficient, profitable order. Vincent never appeared to be in charge. He maintained his role as a quiet, unobtrusive inmate who folded laundry and read books. But Tank recognized the signs of his influence everywhere. Disputes were resolved through negotiation rather than violence. Contraband flowed through established channels with minimal interference. Even the guards seemed calmer, more professional. "It's like he rewrote the whole place," Carlos observed one evening. They were sitting in Tank's cell counting profits from their latest shipment of smuggled goods. 6 months ago, this block was a war zone. Now it runs like a business. Tank nodded, but he was troubled by something he couldn't quite articulate. Vincent had delivered everything he'd promised: wealth, power, security. Tank's crew was more prosperous than they'd ever been. So why did he feel like he was losing something essential? The answer came during their final meeting in the chapel. Vincent stood at the altar as before, but this time his demeanor was different, more formal, more final. "Gentlemen," he began, "our arrangement has been profitable for everyone involved, but it's time to discuss long-term sustainability." Tank felt a chill of premonition. "What do you mean?" "I mean that successful organizations require evolution. What worked during the startup phase may not be appropriate for mature operations." Vincent's tone was businesslike, professional. "You've all proven your value as soldiers. Now I need to determine who has the potential to become a lieutenant." The words hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Tank realized that Vincent had been evaluating them from the beginning, not just their usefulness, but their ultimate loyalty. This had never been a partnership between equals. It had been a job interview that lasted months. "What kind of test?" Rico asked nervously. Vincent smiled, and Tank saw something in his eyes that made his blood run cold. "The kind that determines whether you're willing to do whatever it takes to protect this organization, including eliminating threats from within." The implications were unmistakable. Vincent was asking them to prove their loyalty by betraying someone. But whom? Tank looked around at his crew, men he'd known for years, and realized that any one of them could be the target. Or all of them. "Who?" Tank asked simply. Vincent's smile widened. "Someone has been talking to federal investigators, sharing information about our operations. That person needs to be silenced permanently." Tank felt the trap closing around him like steel jaws. He thought he was gaining power, but he'd actually been surrendering it piece by piece. Vincent had never needed partners. He'd needed pawns. And now those pawns were being asked to sacrifice themselves to protect the king. The chapel fell silent except for the distant sound of evening count beginning in the main block. Tank stared at Vincent, finally understanding the true nature of the man he'd been dealing with. This wasn't just a criminal. This was something far more dangerous. A predator who fed on the souls of other predators. "Well," Vincent asked pleasantly, "who's ready to prove their loyalty?" So there it is, the moment when power reveals its true face, when partnership becomes predation. Vincent Torino didn't just survive prison. He transformed it into his personal kingdom. But every kingdom needs sacrifices, and every king demands absolute loyalty. If this story left you thinking about the price of power and the nature of survival, we'd love to have you as part of our community. Hit that subscribe button and join us for more stories that explore the darkest corners of human ambition. What would you have done in Tank's position? When faced with the choice between survival and soul, which would you choose? Let us know in the comments, because the most dangerous prisons aren't always the ones with bars.